I recently became a parent and discovered a new world full of polarizing opinions.
Babies are people too, and forcing anyone to sleep when they're not tired is inhumane.
One of the most debated questions is whether sleep training, which is teaching your kid to fall asleep independently, causes lasting harm because it involves a degree of crying.
Have you ever heard of sleep training?
No, what's that?
Sleep training is when your baby hits like 6 months old, and then when they cry, you just leave them alone to cry so they self-soothe.
Okay.
And then they learn so that they're not reliant on you coming to get them every time they cry. People think they're going to be too reliant on you. That's because we live in a Western society that enforces way too much independence.
Like many parents, I was exhausted after many sleepless nights. So I started looking into it, and within 2 minutes of searching, I discovered two opposing camps. One, it's safe and you can choose, or two, there's no choice, it's harmful and abusive. Article headlines like this one are pretty scary. I needed answers from my own family, so I went all in. I scraped the data from this Reddit post, which asked for fair reasoning from both sides of the story and got 500 answers, categorizing each of them according to the person's views. Each of these markers represents an opinion on sleep training. The data shows that public discourse is extremely divided. This was true on Instagram, where I looked at the positions of the top 20 sleep training influencers. I noticed that people on both sides were citing articles, so I looked into the media landscape by scraping the last 200 articles on Google News with titles or descriptions containing the keywords baby sleep, cried out, or sleep training. Most of the articles were from non-experts pushing their opinion on both sides of the debate. Then I found an academic paper with an analysis of sleep training opinions for published books, still completely divided. But here's where things got surprising. When I looked at literature reviews from the last 3 decades, analyzing a total of 75 clinical trials with 30,000 babies, the clinical consensus isn't divided. To date, no published research points to sleep training causing harm, and the majority of published pediatric sleep researchers advocate sleep training. This got me even more confused. Why was the conversation online largely against sleep training? What the hell are people claiming, and what evidence were they relying on? I spoke to Chrissy Lawler, one of the most influential sleep training profiles on Instagram and TikTok, to hear her experiences on the platforms.
There's nothing in the scientific literature that says sleep training is harmful. We know that it's safe, we know that it's effective, and we know that there are multiple ways that we can sleep train a baby. And knowing that I'm doing something that's good for these babies, that's good for these families, and then being so misunderstood, it's just really hard on me personally. I've had a couple instances where, I've tried to be canceled, for lack of a better word, when literally hundreds of messages like, you're a horrible person, I hope you burn in hell. And while you're burning and you're screaming out in agony, I hope that nobody comes to save you, just like you didn't save that baby when she was crying out for help. And I was like, wait a second, this baby cried for 6 minutes. And I've had many influencers that I've worked with that will say, I want to pay you for your services. I can't talk about it because my community will come after me. I can't put myself on that platform. I can't have my parenting criticized. And so there are a lot of people that do sleep train, but can't talk about it. And if you feel like, oh, I do this thing and it actually really helped me, but I can only whisper about it, then it does shift the dialogue and make people think that as a collective, we've decided that we're not sleep training anymore. This is the age of information, and we are the most anxious generation of parents that have ever parented.
Looking at the research being referenced by people, I noticed that two prominent voices dominate the conversation: Dr. Sears and Dr. Narvaez. Both are cited as sources in hundreds of posts and articles warning against sleep training. Dr. Sears claims that crying during sleep training alters brain structures. I asked Dr. Jody Mindell, who led 3 of the 8 literature reviews on sleep training, to help me analyze the research cited by Dr. Sears and Narvaez and confirm whether their conclusions were accurate.
I am very concerned about the science that is presented. Every article we looked at, and we looked at every reference that was included in those articles, had basically nothing to do with sleep training.
Dr. Mindell assessed the study's reference to determine their relevance by looking at 2 criteria: relevance and grounding.
So many of them were animal studies that were looking at putting animals in poor situations, or they were not related to sleep training at all. They were related to some other realm. The studies that have been done, and there are many studies looking at the outcomes of sleep training, has found without a doubt improvements in babies, improvements in their baby's sleep, improvements in baby's mood, improvements in parent well-being, improvements in long-term outcome.
The other mainstream claim made by Dr. Narvaez is that sleep training undermines secure attachment. The most conclusive evidence against this claim comes from a recent randomized controlled trial which followed 326 infants for 5 years. It found no difference, negative or positive, between sleep-trained children and those who aren't sleep-trained.
We have to be very careful about what science we look at and whether or not we can make conclusions. So almost all, or even all, literally all of the science that has been presented about these intense damage to babies' brains has nothing to do with sleep training. These are studies that are looking at babies who have been severely neglected or abused, or babies who've been in incredibly stressful situations.
I repeatedly saw the argument that sleep training is a Western concept, which is admittedly true, or that it's very recent. Also true. But you could say the same thing about formula and vaccines, and in my opinion, it isn't a good enough reason to refute all of the available data and accuse people of child abuse. I'm not here to advocate sleep training, nor do I think it's an all-encompassing solution for every parent, but I am making a case against misinformation influencing people's judgments, especially if it might help families. You can read the full interactive version of the story on the pudding.